Okay, I think we're ready to start. Uh, Panelists, if you could unmute yourself. Hi, everyone who has joined us in our Zoom today. I'd like to welcome you to this discussion. And I'll start by introducing our panel, and then I will lay set some parameters to our discussion today. Uh, Thank you, panelists, for agreeing to participate in this discussion, starting with Dr. Dorothy Espelage, who is the William C. Friday Distinguished Professor of Education. Her research focuses on school-based social emotional interventions, including issues of bullying, harassment, and violence. Trinity Pellis is a school social worker. Hi, Trin. Brittany Howard is a middle school teacher and also a full-time student in the Master's of School Administration program. Allison Till is a school counselor, and Allison's Cleveland is a school principal. So thanks to our panelists for joining us today. And I'm Chris Scott. I currently teach educational leadership to master's and doctoral students here at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, my alma mater. But my background is in school and district leadership. And in those roles, I had the pleasure of working with compassionate and empathetic teachers and colleagues who really helped me to appreciate that learning doesn't happen to students, it happens within them. And that students really don't learn if they don't feel physically and psychologically safe. And it's the responsibility of the schools every day create and maintain the conditions that are conducive to learning. So at the onset of this pandemic, when the decision was made to close schools, and rightfully so, I began reaching out to my students, most of whom are either teaching full-time like Brittany is, or who are in their internships with principals in neighboring districts. And the response that I got when I would check in with my students ranged from teachers calling every student on their caseload and surveying the family for digital devices and Wi-Fi, to principals having meetings with parents who were angry or upset because the online learning wasn't fast enough or rigorous enough, or we've done this before. I think anyone who's connected to social media knows that parents feel this burden just like school teachers and school leaders do. But what struck me was there was this dominant narrative that was evolving about this shift to online learning, with really little consideration for how closing schools compromise the well-being of many of our students. So that's kind of how this panel originated today. And that, is a conversation with some colleagues in the School of Ed, kind of said, well, we should put this out there. That is important to talk about what are the implications of closing school. And, and our purpose really with this conversation is to raise the issue of student safety and well-being during this unprecedented event. I think it's also important to note that the enormous and immeasurable magnitude of what schools and districts accomplish every day with grossly underfunded resources is further minimized by a narrative that reduces them to just online learning. It is in this crisis, that we see the extent to which our schools not only build our communities, but hold them together. Teachers don't just teach, they advocate, they protect, they develop the hearts and minds of our future citizens. I'd also like to add that the goal of this panel is to elevate the issue of student well-being and safety that schools provide. It's not really to solve that issue. We can't do that. If we could, I'd bottle that baby up. But I do believe that we can collectively generate ideas, and provoke and promote a heightened level of awareness. Just a few more clarifying points. You know, the panel is not about discounting or demeaning or discrediting the outstanding responses that we've seen in some of our local districts that really show the character of the best that schools can be. I've just been really overwhelmed by the resourcefulness. Ideally, though, what will happen is that these conversations that begin here will ripen into new action steps or reinforce some of the actions that are being taken in our districts that match the context and the resources that they have available. Throughout the discussion, I have some questions that'll start us off, but I invite you to enter your questions into the Q&A, and I'll try to reference. I'm not an expert in being on the stage, but I will reference some of the Q&A to keep our conversation going. So to get us started, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to share how the scope and the nature of your work has shifted since we've moved into this response to COVID. Trinity, would you care to get us started?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to be part of this webinar. I'm really glad to be here. I've been a school social worker for 17 years, and I'm a proud UNC graduate, so there's that. I'm also married to a teacher, so I'm understanding, the sort of like the stress and the thoughts that teachers have right now about caring for their students. And I'm also a parent that's going through this digital learning thing just like everybody else. And so, in a lot of ways that's been very, very overwhelming. And of course, my job has changed in all of that as well. I mean, as a school social worker, I'm used to going out into the community all the time, home visits, talking with parents in person, talking with students in person. We've really lost essentially a lot of privacy. School social workers tend to talk to students about things that, we're not going to stand up in front of a classroom and discuss with a student. It's going to be, a private conversation. And having to sort of translate everything over to on a computer screen like this or only via phone, you can't get that privacy that we once could. But in other ways, things have kind of remained a little bit of the same. I mean, we've always had this focus on, food security and access to resources and health and mental health. And we're really trying to push all of that out to families right now. But our attendance, that's the other thing that we spend a lot of time on as social workers, with the state passing laws that say it is no longer required for us to follow up on attendance like we once did. We sort of shifted that, focus on making sure a child is in school every day to just simply hoping for engagement and doing whatever we can to engage students. So that's sort of the nutshell of how social work has changed.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's hear from our principal representative.
Hi, I'm Allison Cleveland. I am also a two-time graduate from UNC. So I'm excited to have been asked to serve on this panel. Yes, this has changed my role dramatically. There's the general descriptions of the things that I do on a day-to-day basis that might fall under what I would typically do on a day-to-day basis, but the way and the manner in which I'm doing them is completely different. And the level at which I am communicating is nonstop. I like to think of myself as a leader by example or a leader alongside. So I'm doing the things with my teachers. I'm attending PLTs and lesson planning with them. I'm talking to students and understanding and developing, getting feedback from them and engaging with the students, and everything I'm doing is with everybody. This has shifted in that now more of what I'm doing is I'm getting information and I'm quickly turning it around and just making the decisions. I'm asking for feedback, but the decisions had to be made so quickly. At this time of year, I typically wouldn't be thinking about the logistics and this bell schedule for the current school year. I would be thinking about where we are here, how are we going to prepare for the end of grade testing, and starting to do some future planning. So a lot of that future planning is sort of on the back burner, and it's all day to day. So how do we see the fire and put it out? How do we build the ship as we float down the river? Absolutely, there's more focus around motivation and building connections. Students, especially in middle school, many of you know, really function on connecting with other students and with their teachers, very much with their teachers. So we are trying to create virtual experiences and opportunities for them to stay connected to the school in order to stay motivated to learn. A lot of middle school students don't have the maturity level or the prefrontal cortex all the way formed to know that I'm making my decision to learn today at 12 years old to impact my future next year or the year after or the year after. They're not there yet. So we're trying to motivate them in different ways. And when you don't have grades, chasing the learning and not the grade is a new concept for a lot of kids. So we're trying to figure out new ways to deliver feedback, to motivate students, build connections, like I said before. So the other thing that I'm doing a lot of, besides the typical communicating with parents, is supporting my teachers in a completely different way. In the past, you support your teachers and you try to challenge and put a fire under them and give them a lot of information and education and support them to grow that way. With some of my teachers right now, I'm just supporting them to be motivated themselves, because this is a completely different experience. A lot of teachers are connectors themselves. A lot of teachers get energy from being with their students. And so when they're not with their students, they feel a little lost. So I'm motivating them in a completely different way as well.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a great point. There's this commonality, almost like a separate language with educators. When they get around other educators, they just talk about kids. So it just kind of illuminates that how present, they are in the perspective of teachers in their lives. What about from Brittany? Share from us what the classroom perspective.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. Actually, I think Ms. Cleveland put it really well. I am one of those connectors that I didn't recognize I was until this happened. Before this time, I thought I was very instructionally minded, data driven, and that is true, but all of that came through my relationship with my students. And so not being able to see them every day and talk to them and just, check up on them and hear what they're thinking and learn more about them has made it a lot more challenging for me intrinsically to be motivated to continue pushing out work, creating resources, and even thinking ahead to what they'll need academically next year. My primary concern has been how they're doing right now. How are you today? Are your needs being met? Do you feel like you're being emotionally supported? I know that this is difficult for me as an adult, and so I can't imagine how challenging it would be for most of my kids who are 10 to 12 years old, really trying to digest what's happening and navigate all of these new circumstances that they're now in the midst of. So it's changed a lot. I would say the biggest part is being able to be adaptive in what I'm giving to kids. So we're still doing online instruction, but that's a lot harder when all of my kids don't have internet access in the morning. Sometimes they have to go to grandma's house and that's not until 7. And so being able to see the work they're doing and then get feedback and then trust that they'll be able to see the feedback to make the changes or to learn from it has been really new territory for me to navigate. But at the same time, I think I've learned a lot technology wise, but I've also learned a lot about what learning looks like in the sense of when it just comes down to content. What does that look like? How can we tell outside of assessments, outside of being in your face, and really trying to manipulate what I'm giving students so that I can tell, so that what we're doing moving forward is meaningful and not just a check mark on my work log every day.
Thank you. Thank you. And last, let's see, Angela.
Thank you for having me again on this panel. good to be here. Similar to Trinity, as a school counselor and in middle school, this is actually finishing up my 27th year. And I am a graduate of North Carolina Central University. I have to put it out there. All said UNC. But I'm really glad to be here. What has changed is that I also am used to greeting all the students every day, seeing them every day, to check in with them. Sometimes you can even talk, you can see kids when they walk through the door if there's something wrong with them. So you can say, let's go to my office. And just like Trinity says, most of our conversations are private, and there wouldn't be conversations in front of a classroom or with other teachers and so forth. So my concern is that because I don't have that interaction with them, I can't see by just looking at them if there's something wrong, and so I can't address it with them and help them deal with it. My concern are for those students who have problems at home, who are dealing with things at the household that are chaotic and don't have the support from their family, not because they don't want to, but because they don't know how. So that's the challenging thing for us, and that's concerning for me, not just having that interaction with them. However, during this time, I have been able to spend more time with my teachers, sitting in with their team meetings, where it's what we want to do when we are in school. But as you all know, a lot of times we're pulled because we are dealing with a lot of crisis and things like that. So we're not able to spend as much time as we anticipate. But this time has given me time to collaborate more with our students. And because they are doing Google Classroom and Zoom meetings, we are able to talk to one another, and they'll let us know who they are concerned about, who hasn't checked in, who they haven't, who does not have internet access, so that we can check in with them in other ways. So it has shifted. The interaction I am missing immensely. Didn't realize how much I would miss it at this time. But we're learning from day to day. I really think this is going to be a new norm. We're learning more through technology. And I think even when we begin school again, we will utilize some of these skills that we're learning because of this pandemic.
Thank you. And Dr. Espelage, do you care to share? We're in a different space in higher ed. Would you care to share some of your thoughts and perspectives on the shift of the work during COVID?
Sure, yeah. So when I first heard that schools might be closing, my social justice bent went, who's going to feed the children? So I went right to feed the children. And then when we saw all of the various school districts in the state and other places where I work doing that, okay, but that took a while, right? So then you think, okay, who are those kids that I'm worried about, which, and I immediately then was concerned of those kids where I knew school was a safe haven for them, that it was the place where they not only were fed, but they had relationships and people that believed in them. And then immediately I thought of the most vulnerable populations that we work with, whether it's students with disabilities, whether it's gender and sexual minority youth that may not be in affirming families. I was concerned about screen time, and what I know in my research that the more time kids spend on screen time with less supervision, which beautiful what's happening right now, that we have higher rates of cyberbullying. So the numbers in my data came to life, and faces came with that data to suggest what are these kids doing. Very much concerned about kids that needed this semester to graduate for recovery credit. That knowing the vulnerability and the challenges in their home, that learning may not happen such that they might not graduate. So there's a whole host. I could put them all in little groups, Chris, but I appreciate hearing from, all of you, the social workers, the counselors. This is informative for us to think about what is this going to look like going forward. And as you said, it's the new normal, our new world. So thank you.
Well, I would like to follow up that first question with a question kind of the same, just sharing your perspective, but I'd like to shift it a little bit. And I know as a principal, you know, I had students who I would often refer to as frequent flyers. You know, they made us pay attention to them, and so, but there were also students when they were absent, I noticed immediately. And even when I started thinking about this panel, certain students, you know, they came to mind, and I thought about, wow, how powerless, you know, it feels to know that they don't have school, that they don't have access to, as Dorothy shared, this space that affirms them and where they find love and relationships. And so I want to ask the panel, like, you know, respecting confidentiality, of course, but who are the students that you're worried about?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I'm concerned about those students who I know that have difficulty in their households. Another concern, what we have to realize is that during pandemics or, you know, things of this nature, you know, domestic violence increases, you know, sexual abuse increases. So those students who I know who may have had those situations happening, I am concerned about those students as well. And I feel somewhat hopeless because, you know, you look in Power School and you try to find the numbers, and a lot of times the numbers are not updated. So we try to stress the parents often to please make sure we have their emergency numbers, especially things like this. But those are the students I'm looking for. I'm concerned about. The students also that you talked about that comes up to you every day, who are very needy, who needs that attention, and for good reason, right? So again, those are the some of the students that I'm thinking of that comes to my mind up front.
I would agree absolutely with Angela that those are the students that are foremost in my mind. I'm really concerned about our kiddos that don't have any internet yet. You know, here we are already assigning things. We're in week 3 of digital learning for our county, and we've got kids who still haven't had 1 minute of internet access for them. And so I worry about their academic futures. I'm also really worried about our homeless students. In our county, we have several thousand students who qualify as homeless. And our county didn't already have a wonderful idea. We didn't have homes to provide for thousands of kids. And now, you know, where are they now? Some of them we haven't been able to reach. So I'm very concerned about them. And I'm also really worried about our newly unemployed families who maybe have never faced unemployment before. They've never faced these sorts of challenges before. They're not the families that have ever come to me for help before. They don't know how to ask. They're embarrassed to ask. The kids don't want to say, hey, this is happening. It's never happened to me before. They're so confused, and trying to push out resources and trying to normalize, hey, it's okay to ask for help. It's a sign of strength to say, hey, you know, what's out there for me, to try to get that message out to families. So, you know, I'm concerned about lots, but those are sort of like my big categories that I'm concerned for.
Thank you.
I'm going to step in and sort of piggyback on everything that you've said so far. I agree completely. We are finishing our device distribution event right now. We've had it on from middle of the day through this afternoon. And we will have more families that will need more, and around hotspots as well. I need to speak for some other groups too. I think Dorothy said that there's students who don't have some that aren't affirmed at home. We've got students who come to school and work hard and are pleasers and really get their energy from finding some success within their classes, but they have to work hard to find the success. And this learning is going to be challenging for them. And my concern for some of those students is, are they going to lose that motivation? Are they going to figure, why do I try? This is really hard. This is really hard for me to understand it kind of on my own. Yes, the teachers are accessible, but again, it's not always easy to go ask a question online. And another group that I'm concerned about is our students with special needs. We have amazing special educators that are doing everything they can, but at the end of the day, the service delivery just won't be as robust as is needed. And we have parents that aren't special educators, and although they know their children and love their children, they may not have the skill base to be able to support their children in learning at the rate and with the specialized designed instruction that they need. So that is a concern for me moving forward as well.
Thank you.
I can't say that there is a specific demographic of students or any student in particular that I'm not worried about. I think of all of my kids and I can't think of any of them where I'm like, that kid will be fine. They'll come out of this unscathed and perfectly fine for the next year. But in particular, in addition to all of those students you all mentioned, I think about my students who have diagnosed or undiagnosed mental health issues, and who, even me, having been in education for 6 years now and feeling like I'm pretty patient, thinking about how they really draw that patience out of me, if you will, and how even parents who maybe haven't had discipline issues with their children before are having a challenging time being at home with them every day, all day long, and how those kids are adapting to that new family dynamic of we're here all the time, I'm not really understood, I require a lot of patience and grace. And even for parents who don't know how to give that, in the same way a lot of parents don't understand how to give special education resources and scaffolding and all of that. So thinking about those kids who we know, being with them every day, that you just have to give, a couple of extra minutes, and thinking about how they are coping with these circumstances in their homes now.
Thank you. So we have a question in our Q&A. I'm trying to remember to look at that. And this is, it's kind of it's from Dana. And Dana asks, how often is too often to reach out to parents to check on them or to encourage them to have their kids engage in learning? Our guidance counselor and social worker are talking to parents to make sure their daily life needs are met, but then to see why their kids are not engaging in the learning. The parents say they will have their child engage, but nothing ever changes. And that question kind of aligns with some sentiment I received from one of my students who's an intern, who was talking about teams of teachers feeling frustrated at the response rate. So could some of our panelists speak to that? How often is too often, and what does it mean to reach out to parents when you're not noticing students show up and engage?
Well, I would say that it's a case-by-case basis, which I know is not, the answer that everybody wants to hear, that, 5 times a week or 2 times a week, you can't really give that. If you feel like this is a family that needs the extra support to just give them a call every other day, then I would say give them a call every other day, or a quick email check-in, or just asking them, what's the best way for your family? How often do you want me to check in? For some families, once a week feels like just all that they can handle, and anything more feels pushy. And for some families, if you call them every single day, they will be happy for it. Just like our kids have varying levels of needs, our families really have varying levels of needs.
Allison, were you going to speak also?
I was just going to now sort of add to that is it depends on the age of the student. If it's a secondary student, the teacher may want to reach out to the student via the student's district email address, or a phone call to the home and ask for the student, maybe even send a note in the mail. I mean, old school mail still works sometimes. And some of those personal connections is what the students are showing up for. They're showing up because the teacher's expressing care and the teacher's expressing concern. So I had my band teacher wrote a personal note and mailed it to every single member of her band. Now, if you know much about secondary bands, they're pretty big, right? Her band and her orchestra. So it took her all of spring break, but her participation in an elective from day one was like 95%, which is unheard of on day one in remote learning. So I think just, it's more about the expression of care from the teacher to the student. The student might say, you know what? I told her I'd show up at my Google Meet today, so I'm just going to.
Thank you. So another question has to do, this is from Leanne, has to do with, and I think it's directed at Trinity as a social worker. How are you connecting with students that you haven't heard anything from? Are you able to do home visits?
Well, thanks to the situation, no, we're really not able to do home visits, and it's difficult because that was a huge portion of the job, was making that personal connection. So we're relying on Google Meet, Zoom if it's just with the parents. We're relying on phone calls, emails, and even snail mail, as Allison said. I mean, I've never sent so many notes via mail to students. It feels like we're, sending something to the Voyager spacecraft and waiting days for the answer. But that's what we're in. We're kind of in a slower mode right now, even though we all want to run to be able to help students. So sending out electronic newsletters and announcements. I've never called down the list so far. We've got all these like emergency contacts, and so I'm calling second cousin in New Jersey to get the latest phone number for somebody, or a better email, or whatever we can do. I'm mining Power School for anything I've got. I have all of my notes and records, old phone numbers, texting families. I've got a Google Voice set up. So I'm doing everything I can short of actually knocking on doors. And usually it works, but there is no magic wand in this.
I think that's a part of the challenge is, we know that there are students who we can't reach. And, when you can make a home visit and you can, knock on a door, that, creates a different level of assurance that we don't have right now. For those who we do have some degree of access to, I'd like the panel to really share, to share their perspective on what are some of the, maybe not red flags, but maybe yellow flags that raise concern when you are either in an online learning space. What are some look-fors that educators should take note of when they're in those spaces, when you think about student well-being? And maybe it will be helpful to narrow that a little bit, to say, what are some look-fors you would want, that you would take note of for, say, for example, physical or emotional maltreatment? What does that look like in a digital space? We know what it looks like when they come to school.
Well, as far as emotional maltreatment, or just in general concern about mental health, we were fortunate, if there's any fortune in any of this, that this occurred here in the springtime, and we've had the chance for over a semester to get to know our students. So we know what they were like all the way up through February and the beginning of March. And so, if you've got a kid that, has been outgoing and all of a sudden shows up on Zoom, just like, and they're participating, but it's just off, and it's off. I mean, if this was the first week of school, you might just think, oh, this is maybe a kid that isn't as motivated or is just frustrated, but this is a huge change. Anytime you're noticing a change in a child, that's something to take note of. It's not necessarily a red flag, as you said, but a yellow flag. You know, finding out what it is that's really going on. And so maybe that would be an appropriate time to reach out to them personally to say, hey, I noticed that you seemed really frustrated today, or it almost seemed like you were going to cry today. This is not something you want to bring up you know, in the middle of class. Hey, Johnny, I see that you're about to cry, you know, and there's 20 other students there. But noting that and, you know, addressing it after the fact, giving a phone call home, an email, something personal to know, you know, hey, I notice and I care, and being able to provide a resource behind that. Like if a kid, you know, bursts out crying then over the phone and says, you know, I'm going through all these things, everything's so difficult, I don't know what to do. It's great to say, I'm so sorry, this is very difficult, but also to be able to provide some information on telemental health right now. Or there are text lines that students and adults can access by texting, and they can talk with a crisis counselor that's completely free, and they can direct them. So, you know, there are resources out there, and depending on what county you're in, you should know the mental health resources that are in your family, or in your county. And if you don't, now would be a great time to reach out to your school counselor or your school social workers to get that information, so you have something to give to a child.
Thank you. Thank you. Anything else?
I'm gonna just jump in on that too. Some other signs to look for outside of the visual signs is what the students, what they submit. So we should read everything that they have. If you ask them to write something, you should read it. Sometimes in their journaling or their feedback or their creative writing, they might express something that could be concerning. I know in my county, we've created or updated our crisis plan, and that for teachers and principals and counselors to follow. And so it provides scenarios of if a teacher observes this or has a concern of this, these are the steps you follow, right? And it's updated now that we're remote as compared to what it was when we were face-to-face. So in there, one thing would be is if there's something written that shows a concern that of maybe there's abuse or wanting to hurt, you know, self-harming, then there's steps for you to follow with that.
Well, and you know, I know that we're in an unprecedented time, and there's no way we could really plan for this, but that I think is a best practice, to have a response or a protocol for everyone connected to the organization to be able to follow, that really respects the fact that we want to ensure that students are, you know, that they're taken care of, and that we still have a responsibility. You know, that when you think about like reports that are made, you know, teachers and school workers are responders. You know, they report evidence, suspicions of abuse, and that in this, you know, current situation should be heavily reinforced. So thank you for sharing that. Any other comments?
I do something similar with the reflection journal. So about twice a week, I ask my students really specific questions. What was the hardest thing that happened this week? What was the best thing that happened? What's one thing you regret? And I leave it open-ended like that, so I'm not, I guess, fishing for incidents of abuse or, you know, children not getting what they need, being neglected. But it also gives them room, and I'm kind of hoping that because I have a relationship with them, they'll find a safe space in that to be honest about what's going on. Because I do think the hard part is that for middle schoolers, I've only ever worked with middle schoolers, so I know for them for sure, a lot of times they have a hard time articulating what's wrong. And so they may very well be having a hard time, or maybe they are being neglected, or maybe something is abusive, but if they don't have, I guess, like a barometer for that, then they won't know to call it that. And so asking them to describe things with more of just a general description, as opposed to, like, we have an app we use where students can report issues of abuse or neglect. But like I said, it requires them identifying it as such first. And I think that that's where the problem is that if they don't have the language for it, then it's hard to describe what's happening to them. And then it makes it even more challenging for us to respond as adults. So the reflection journals have been very helpful. And then just checking in with kids and asking them, you know, via text or phone call. Sometimes I have my kids send me videos of themselves so I can see their face and, you know, respond to those same questions so I can see how they look when they read the question. Oh, what's the hardest thing that happened? And I can tell if, you know, there's something they're not mentioning for the sake of maybe keeping it private or not wanting to bring it up.
Thank you. That's a great idea. Creating avenues for students to be able to share what's going on in their world. We have a question in the chat box from Stephen. My truthful and most authentic worry is that the issue is going to further and drastically affect the gaps that are so impacting certain communities, kids, and families. Even now, the quote unquote response protocols and policies are supporting the students and families that already have access, privilege, etc. What can we do? What should we be speaking to fervently? What conversations do we have globally, or what conversations do we have globally, weekly, hourly to press the issue? How can we continue to fight against the systemic oppression when the pandemic response is a systemic one? I have thoughts, as we all do, but this is the conversation I believe. I would love to hear panelists' thoughts on this. I think that's, it raises an important point that in this crisis, we see that those who are already marginalized are the ones who, you know, are most vulnerable. Probably should put my glasses on so I can read the chat box.
So
Would
Chris,
anyone...
I'll offer kind of at least my perspective. I think Trinity mentioned the homeless population in North Carolina, the hotel families that folks are doing some great work of getting some of their basic needs of diapers and those types of things taken care of in some of our counties. I think that's part of the issue, right? Is that oftentimes on these webinars or things that I've attended, those silenced populations, the most vulnerable, are not even named, right? Like I was like applauding when Trinity's like, oh my goodness, you know, that we have to own that. And I think go into that uncomfortable space and recognize that we have tremendous inequities in education prior to this. That is decades, if not centuries in the making, right? And so I think owning that, understanding it, and trying to do as much as we can to push back against this learn, test scores, these types of things, and recognize how can we bolster the support for those kids that were on the edge prior to this, who were about to fail, that this is just one more struggle that they have. So how do we continue to do the work and try to get to those families? And not have an assumption. Trinity also, or somebody mentioned, I think it was Angela, who had beautiful words to say, it's not that these families that are facing multiple challenges don't want to get online and spend hours doing homework and learning the new math. They just may not have the bandwidth or the, you know, the whatever to do it, but they have that desire. So we're seeing this in the hotel families. Like they want, now that they have diapers and they have food, they would really like tutors. But how are we going to tutor in the front office? And do we scrub it down and then we have tutors wearing masks? Like how do we get, you know, or how do we use this virtual world when in fact getting on Zoom or having a camera itself or having a laptop or, yeah. So I think we need to own it and then push up against it because there's plenty of people that will ignore it and be in their own little world of just how unfortunate they are.
Yeah.
Part of the issue.
I also, that's a great question. I don't have the answer for it, but I think just having platforms like this and making people aware is important, and it is a start. You know, I was on a webinar last week on, you know, social distancing and education beyond, online and all of this. And it was so funny because we are so used to having the access and having access to internet and Wi-Fi and so forth. And one of the questions was, well, how do you reach those kids who don't have internet? How do we give them the same information? So the panelist said, well, just tell them to email you that they don't have it. And I'm like, how can they email you? They don't have internet. So, and I think it's just something that we are so used to having that sometimes we have to keep reminding ourselves and reminding our educators that it's not that we don't want to help or we don't want to find ways to reach out, but we have to continue to be cognizant and be aware and make other people aware so that we can start coming up with some answers. And, for instance, one of our biggest things is our students not having internet service and not having a computer. They may have a phone, but those things are not compatible to the things that the teachers are needing to use. So what are we going to do? And I'm hoping that because of this situation we're in, that this will open eyes and help, like what is Verizon going to do? What is Sprint going to do as far as providing Wi-Fi or providing hotspots to people? I know that has been given to some at some points, but still not everybody knows about it. So how do we get that information to the people who need to know? What do we do? So that is something I think we do need to continue to work at, and hopefully having more panelists, or discussions like this would help.
And I want to say that I think we should think or be reminded that having access and having a laptop does not necessarily close the achievement gap. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we're providing equitable practices to all students just because we've given them a device and a hotspot. So we have to, like Dorothy said, we need to name the problem and we need to start analyzing it in a different light. I don't have the answer. I'm not suggesting I have the answer, but I just want to make sure that we broaden our perspective a little bit around the home situations that all of our students are in. So we could have one student who's got access and two educated parents who have always had their culture is that they value education and they went to college or have multiple advanced degrees. And so they are going to be better equipped to support their student with their learning at home. There could be another student who we provide them the access, we provide them the hotspot, but they have one parent at home and that parent works shift work and has to go to work and isn't able to support their student in their home to learn. But there's just more to consider about why there are the inequities within our public education system in our country than just our access to devices and hotspots.
Yes, thank you for making that point. Yeah, it's like saying that just because you have these devices and this hotspot, if you do have them, well, that's just like having a classroom where we know that's just geography. It's just the space. And so we have another question along those lines with remote. This is from Teresa. With the shift to remote learning, the focus has been on learning. However, we know that students can't learn when they don't feel safe and when they are under stress. Nearly every family today is experiencing uncertainty and stress. What messaging can we send to families to help them de-stress and focus on their child's emotional health? In what ways can teachers embed social emotional learning for all students in this environment?
I'll speak to that. So I think the last question, not the last one, but a couple of questions back, someone had asked about contacting parents, specifically about their student finishing work, which I'm glad I didn't have to answer because I have a lot of thoughts on contacting parents about their kids trying to finish work right now. But I do think that it's important that when I contact parents, my first question is, how are they? What do they need? What's going on? Like I love teaching, but instruction as we have known it is the very last thing on my mind right now. I'm most concerned about can my students get what they need? Are they connected with the people who can like give those resources to them? And then after that, are they in a place where they can engage with learning? Because I do think that if you negate all of that, number one, what you're saying is that it's not important to you as the educator that those needs be met for students or families. And then on top of that, you're saying that what you have posted to Google Classroom is also simultaneously more important than all of those things. And so I think before we're contacting parents to ask why their kids haven't turned something in or why they haven't logged in, the first question needs to be, what do they need access to? And then connecting them to the people who can make sure that those resources get in their hands.
Thank you. Thank you, Brittany.
And I've got two practical things that teachers can do to sort of address this question. One geared more towards students and one geared more towards families. So if you are doing a live class, so you're meeting at 10:30 on Wednesdays, and that's your class, that you go ahead and take the first few minutes of every class to do a check-in, like what Brittany has said, and give everybody the opportunity to speak. You don't have to force everybody to speak, but go around and just say, what did y'all have for breakfast today? Something that promotes connection for students, something that everybody can share. You know, why did you pick out the color shirt you're wearing today? Something that's accessible to every kid, so that, you know, it's a basic check-in for them. And, you know, as you do that more and more, your students get used to that sort of line of questioning. Students tend to open up and you can ask some deeper questions at some point. And then as far as families, I would encourage doing a Zoom or a Google Meet, if families have access to this, where you explicitly teach families things that might feel really basic to you, but for a family that's under stress or has limited resources, teaching them that it's a good idea to keep a normal bedtime and a normal wake up time right now, that it's okay to be stressed, and here are some things you can do to reduce stress, and here are some normal reactions that kids have. They might need more attention. Your teen might shut themselves up in their room more, and that's normal. And giving families sort of the opportunity to share within that yes, this is happening, almost like group therapy. And we're not in the business of providing group therapy, but providing that social outlet for families to be able to talk about a specific topic that might really help with their child's behavior or mental health. I think those two things, that if teachers are able to do, you know, in addition to teaching Common Core math or whatever else you're doing, to be able to put that out and present that. And that's something that your school social workers and your school counselors can either take the lead on or be part of it with you, so you don't have to feel like as a teacher that you're out there trying to teach all the social emotional learning skills.
Yeah, and to add to that, having a schedule, you know, encouraging your families to have a schedule. I have to say, and I'm transparent, the first couple of weeks during this, I was so stressed out. I felt so overwhelmed. I felt like I was working 10 times harder than what I was doing when I was at school, and I was just kind of all over the place. So if I was feeling that way, and I am, you know, conscious of being mindfulness of, you know, doing things to lessen the stress, then I can only imagine how other families and students are doing. So what I've recognized is that having a schedule, you know, waking up at a certain time, you know, eating some breakfast or what have you, whatever is good for you, but also making sure you take breaks. I've recognized that, you know, I would work all the way till 2 o'clock, you know, and not have lunch. So, and when I was talking to some of my students, you know, they were all over the place, like some of them not sleeping or getting up very late and staying up very late. And, you know, it's important to have a balance. So encouraging your parents to give them that support to do that would help them relieve some of the stress as well. And so, and then we have to remember, it's not just the students, it's the whole families. Like, you know, there are families who are working and there may be one computer, you know, so that we're asking for our students to do online work, but, you know, their parent may be working remotely as well and may need that computer, or there may be students who are taking care of the younger students. So there's so many different environments that we also have to be aware of. And every situation and every family is different, but establishing a schedule for everyone can help limit some of the stress that everybody is experiencing.
Yeah, I think, we as adults, we create a coherent narrative about like what's going on and what our circumstances. And, for kids who don't have that, it does, create this, what I would, call, and my colleague can correct me if I'm wrong, but like almost like this psychosocial stress. And kids need somewhere to put that. But that does raise a question or raise a point about like how schools are communicating with families and identifying gaps that have to be closed in order for that communication to translate and to make it to where it's supposed to be, So, how are we addressing second language learners? We have very, very diverse neighbors throughout the triangle and beyond who are, linguistically marginalized, because we have this, everything is written and spoken mostly in English, and even our ELL teachers and support staff don't always have the command of the native language of the students they serve. Has our panel seen any best practices around addressing those gaps?
Well, I know in our district, we have translators assigned to each school. So whenever we do know that there is a Spanish-speaking family, they are our mediator, pretty much. So we kind of talk to them and they'll contact them. And our families are very familiar with our translators. So when they have questions, they are able to contact them directly to get the message and emails to us as well. So we are working on that. We're concerned about that as well. So, but we're trying to do everything that we can to make sure that we are bridging that gap.
I actually teach ESL and ELA at the same time. And so about 90% of my kids are Spanish speaking at home and are still learning English fluently. So for my team, thankfully, 2 of us speak Spanish well enough to call home. We have a translator, but my school is also about 50% Spanish speaking. And so having one translator, that becomes pretty overwhelming. One practical thing that I have seen be used by our team teachers who don't speak Spanish is using text or Google Voice text messaging remind, because it not only gives you the opportunity to use apps like Google Translate, but at the same time, it kind of gives those parents the space and the time to read the message, digest it, figure out how they need to respond without having to translate on the spot via phone if you're calling in English, or navigate through a middleman with a translator.
Thank you. Anybody else with that one? So we have another question in the chat box. So we have opportunities. This comes from an anonymous attendee. We have opportunities to make some systemic changes in these unprecedented times. How would you complete the sentence? What if we in our defense, we said we would not be providing all the answers. However, I think that's a very I think that's an appropriate question. What if we? I have some thoughts, but I'm wondering if the panel has some thoughts as well.
What if we funded education equitably across our country?
That's, well, yeah. You have my mind.
Mic drop, done. Mic drop, done. Perfect.
Well, and well, let's explore that. What are, like, if we had a magic wand and we could close some of the resource gaps, what would that look like? How would we, what resources would we, let's say we're speaking to someone who can provide us with those resources that we don't have. What do we need? This, you know, when we think about, you know, ensuring the safety and well-being of our students in a time where we can't go knock on the door, what's on that wish list?
I'm going to just start with people.
Yes.
I think the human resource is the most important part, because it's the human relationships and it's the human knowledge that we can use to reach all of our kids and provide safety to all of our kids. So for example, we need more mental health professionals in our schools. Some schools are lucky to have full-time social workers, but that's not the only piece of mental health professionals. And the high schools usually split social workers between 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 high schools, yes, which is 2,000 kids a school. So that's the first piece, I think, is mental health professionals. I think we need more literacy coaches. I think we need more math coaches. I think we need to retain our fantastic teachers who are leaving the field sometimes because they're getting paid much better for less hours. And there's a wealth of knowledge on how to reach kids, and all kids at all levels, that we are not capturing because we are not able to fund it.
Thank you.
I would just like to piggyback on that and you know, give some of the ratios that are out there. As a school social worker, I serve 2 schools. I've served 2 schools for a really long time, sort of a rotating cast, but you know, right now my ratio is 1 to around 1,200. And it's really impossible to be able to meet all of the needs, especially now as the needs have grown and grown and grown because so many people are out of work and under stress. It's impossible on a regular day. Our school psychologists, their ratios are really high. Our school counselors, even though most school counselors are 1 per school, we've got some really large schools, but even so, we should have 2 school counselors in every school. Like Allison said, you know, we could use more mental health professionals. We need school-based mental health where we can actually provide mental health in schools. Some counties have this, some counties don't. But for the counties that do not have it or used to have it and don't anymore, it's a huge barrier to being able to meet the needs of kids in schools, to be able to meet with that mental health professional right there. So like Allison said, there's just a lot of human capital that could really go far to meet the needs of all of the kids. And I know some counties struggle with you know, instructional materials. And so, you know, those are the things that a lot of people think about when they think school funding. They think more desks, more books, and yes, we definitely need all of that. But our counties have been cut to the bone as far as personnel, and there's just no more fat to cut. There wasn't even fat when people were calling it fat.
Yeah. I think about that question also, you know, what if we, I'm gonna go back to the question one of the panelists posed, this whole systemic oppression piece, and just, I think part of what contributes that is there's this paradox where we see, like, okay, if you get an education, that is how you change your social, your place in the social strata, when we know meritocracy is a myth for some, or is a reality for some, but for most of our students, particularly those who represent certain demographics or who represent, you know, the silenced voices in schools, it's not realistic. So I think about, like, this expectation on teachers to continue to create online learning, and I don't know, I almost have this this resistance to that because I don't think that's the most important. I think Brittany alluded to this earlier about like, you know, what it implies if that's what we're focused on, and maybe thinking about, you know, what if the role of teachers in this crisis was, you know, to identify not so much, here are, you know, the remaining 2 months of school and the lesson plans for each week and each day. What if it was creating opportunities to identify, okay, who are the families that I'm connected with? And, you know, and who are the families that I'm not connected with? And how can I reach out to those families? How can I set up, you know, change my pedagogy to, instead of providing these packets and these, you know, the materials for learning, what if I said, okay, today I'm going to break my students up into their social groups, and I'm going to serve groups of students at a time, and we're not going to focus on math. We're going to focus on, you know, learning what, you know, learning what to do when you don't have your friends every day. And I know that that's kind of a fairy tale scenario, because we also have to invest time in providing teachers with the resources to be able to do this. Some of the messages that have come up in the Zoom chat box. So I'm really still kind of green at this. I'm not modeling best practices, I'm afraid, but that are different from what are coming up in the Q&A, speak to the fact that, you know, a number of families are struggling, and they're not families that have access issues, and they're not families that have both parents working, but they're families with advanced degrees, and who really comments about how eye-opening it is to see the process of learning and what exactly their kids have to do in this space. And so I think there's maybe like a message in that as well, you know, that in this shift, you know, we're raising awareness, not just about, you know, student safety and well-being, but also about just the context of learning in, you know, 2020, particularly as we're under the, you know, the pressures of accountability. So we have another question regarding equity. I had a question separately about the equity implications, but I'm really excited to see that it's arising from the Q&A and the chat box. This comes from Chris. As we continue to be more and more aware of the need for equity, I'm heavily concerned about the perceptions of vulnerable students already anchored in implicit bias being cemented rather than broken during the crisis. What are your thoughts about navigating those conversations with teachers and colleagues? That is a really great question.
I think that it's a hard thing to do. And I think it's something that has to happen. I think before this COVID-19, we should have been having these conversations. You know, I'm at a school that is connected to a high school and an elementary school. And our leadership group last year took all 3 school staffs through a training around implicit bias and started to work through some of those conversations to understand equity and understand equitable practices. And the truth of the matter is, not everyone's comfortable having those conversations. So you have to get them to a place of safety themselves to be able to, you can try to engage them in the conversations, but if their walls are up, they won't allow those walls to come down to truly understand the conversation, truly understand what implicit bias means and what implicit bias do I hold, because all of us have some version of implicit bias within us. So how do we allow people to be vulnerable and not feel as though they're going to be judged when they're having the conversation, so they can get to themselves to a place of understanding and learning? Because if they're not at a place where they're able to understand and learn them from themselves, they're going to really struggle to be able to understand and learn more about the perception and perspectives of other people, in order to then be able to change practices.
Yeah, I would add, I think this is a really complex issue because I think you could flip it upside down too and find that my implicit bias about student A may actually be challenged in this environment, right? Because we're taking the audience potentially of the classroom away. We're taking social anxiety of middle school kids. And here they have this opportunity, if they have, you know, an adult to guide them through, where maybe they're not cemented, maybe they're seeing a different learner, but because they saw that kid in the context, whether it was color, whatever that is. So I also think that in some ways, you know, we're thinking about risk, but this type of environment may be protective such that we see kids thriving and you're like, wait a minute, maybe this kid does very well not being a seventh grader in a, you know, that's has some learning challenges and the peers are reminding him that he has learning challenges all the time. So I think that's loaded. And I think that even in the implicit bias world of research, they're calling into question a lot of the science there that can't be replicated. So I think we also just need to be somewhat cautious of that. But I think, you know, I wonder about administration. I know you have a lot on your plate, Allison, but are you having these conversations now with them about how they may be taking that implicit bias as they move into one-on-one instruction or communicating through Google Classroom folders? Or I'm just curious.
I think those conversations are starting, right? So we're week 3, and from the beginning of this, it was just, how do we do this? What does this look like? What training do you teachers need to be able to, you know, create a Google Classroom and a Google Meet? And some are super proficient around that. So some of those logistical things were there first, and then the communication, and then tweaking and changing. We spent a good week of time calling every single family at our school. Like I told you today, we got every kid, but that took a long time and a lot of amazing social worker skills to track down, like you said, call the second cousin in New Jersey to track up, and we did all those things. And then, like I said, today is our device distribution, where today is the day that we're finally getting the devices and the hotspots in the hands of the people that need it. So in the grand scheme, if we had all the time in the world that said, oh, I have a whole summer to plan this, I'm going to lay the groundwork of, let's talk first about our perceptions of our students. Let's talk first about, but that it was like, how do I log in? Go. So the long answer to your short question is we're starting to.
Great.
I think that goes along the lines of that wish list too. You know, time is a resource. Because you know, it's hard to, when you, as a principal, when you have this laundry list of, you know, things you need to do, the conversations you want to have with your staff, you're taking some risks. I think it's important to do this, but you're taking some risks when you say, oh, well, our math scores are blah, 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 and our letter grade on the website for our report card is this, but we're going to talk about implicit bias. But I think that that's a great question, though, because that question gets at the tendency to default to these deficit ideologies about why kids are not engaging and why, you know, parents are not involved, and that those conversations continue to play out, and they're problematic for children who are already marginalized and victimized by these deficits. You know, I've developed this. I don't know, like this, when we talk about bias, it seems to be like this safe substitute maybe for some of the isms that are out there, like institutional racism and classism, and, you know, and so but I think it's a place to start. But I do appreciate Allison's point that it's personal, and you have to create spaces. We have to create and maintain schools that are not just safe for kids, they have to be safe for adults too, to be vulnerable enough to say, yes, I don't wake up every day with this will to, to marginalize brown and black kids. However, I'm also going to work every day in a society that whispers in my ear what normal is, and that anything isn't that, is a problem, is less than. And so we've talked a lot about students and school responses and support and protecting students. Something that I am noticing is, we haven't talked a lot about secondary in terms of high school, and we don't have that represented. It was hard to put an inclusive and representative panel together because everybody's busy. But also, we don't have a special education teacher here. We don't have an English language learner. We don't have a central office person, and we don't have a high school representative. But I would like to raise, to point that out, and really to ask for maybe if my colleague, Dr. Espelage, has any perspectives on the secondary student risk that are out there.
Yeah, I think, Chris, a lot of my concern, because we're in so many high schools now, working with high schoolers and giving them youth voice around safety. So I've spent a lot of time just on Zoom calls with really, really bored high school students. I can tell you, they're really, really bored. And they remind me of my undergrads, but they're so wanting connection and a human connection, right? So we know adolescents, and I happen to teach adolescent development this semester. So I would offer my class, like, oh, get on the Zoom half hour before if you want to just chit chat. I didn't assume, I didn't think they'd show up. Yeah, there'd be 20 of the 45 on there the half hour before just to touch base. And found that to be the same with the high schoolers that we're working with in Oregon and Illinois, North Carolina, and Florida. And so if there's opportunities, like, they are starved for that connection, especially the most vulnerable. And again, the gender and sexual minority youth that I would work through with PFLAG and the GSAs in these schools. And then also kids that have no siblings. I've noticed they show up on these Zoom calls. And so they just want to talk. There's not an agenda, what we would talk about their TikTok videos, or they would share those types of things. So I think when we think about adolescent development, so much of the energy that adolescents get is either from a big group of friends or that one best friend. And so how do we try to find those kids? Again, it's access issue, right? So I'm talking about the ones that are privileged to have Zoom that can connect with me. Other ways in which I've been texting some of them. So I think it's just, the high schoolers look like my undergrads, which are only a couple year difference. And it's really just addressing the boredom that they feel. So bored.
I also think about what happens when students are bored. That phrase, idle hands, and for students who, in high school who have access, what that means in terms of how they may be putting themselves out there on social media. Or in relationships, and how that is a whole nother layer of risk that play out. One of my students who works at the high school level shared how, there is this intense tension in high school homes because they aren't really engaged in the work that they're supposed to be doing, and parents can't really make them engaged. And so he shared this perspective on this conflict that's playing out, like the kids won't do their work, and the parents can't make them do their work. And so but I also think that, we have to be aware of how it's not just the students and how they behave, but we also know we live in a very predatory environment, especially in the digital world. And how are, where are the lessons on digital ethics and safety for our kids so that they know how to protect themselves in that space, because they're vulnerable in that platform as well. So we have about 5 minutes, and I think I've caught up on the Q&A. I would like to have maybe pose one more question. Is what are some strategies that specifically you have observed or that you would recommend from the panel that address student safety and that address the issue of student safety and informing parents?
Well, I'll just jump in here. And one of the things that I have found is a resource out of West Virginia. If you go to YouTube and you search SHIELD, S-H-I-E-L-D, and then WV, SHIELD WV, it pulls up some videos, and they have them divided by elementary, middle, and high school. So these are developmentally appropriate modules. They're short modules that teachers can show, families can show, anybody can show. They focus on wellness and body safety. So teaching, you know, at the younger level, you know, bathing suits and, you know, good touch, bad touch, teaches mindfulness and relaxation, naming emotions. And it does that at different developmental stages. And then it also has an online safety module that teaches kids how to identify potential predators or potential risky situations online. And, you know, these aren't necessarily a huge substitute for a comprehensive program, but it's something to give to parents as a resource, to give to kids as a resource, a jumping off point for those sorts of discussions.
I'll add, Google actually has a pretty cool course for digital citizenship and safety. And so if you are a teacher, I'm not sure if you can access it without like a district account, but I do know that as a teacher, you can assign it to your students, and it takes them through pretty cool games where they are like answering questions and having to show that they understand like what digital citizenship means, what it looks like to be safe, and to practice awareness while you're online.
Thank you, Brittany. Anybody else?
I'd just echo what Trinity said. You know, I've studied bullying and cyberbullying, and we know that kids are first, especially in the binary sense, boys, the first place that they're cyberbullied is when they're gaming, because you have young kids in with older adults. And I think, again, just having conversations, we know that when parents talk to their kids of all ages, even if it's an annoying conversation for the adolescent, to get them to understand that we want them to be in these spaces, but we want to be protective and for things for them to look out for, and to have that conversation, even if there's parents watching this webinar, to just say, hey, I went and listened to this webinar, and have you seen things happening online that make you uncomfortable, and how can they disengage? I think it has to be an ongoing conversation. Many families have had this conversation. I think it's even more important that all of us need to have this conversation in any role. As an auntie, I had a conversation with my 12-year-old that was quarantined with me here for 5 weeks. He's a gamer. I just need to make it very clear that we do not want to tell people on a game where we live. I had a direct conversation about it. This is not what we do. And so I think there's no dancing around it. This is where you're spending time, and I want you to be safe, and we have to communicate.
I'm also posting in the chat room the resource for the SAMHSA disaster distress helpline that kids or adults can text if they're feeling anxious or worried or scared, and any kind of emotion where they just need somebody to talk with. This is a great way. And I'm also going to put in the information for the crisis text line, which is national as well.
Thank you, Trinity. I think, you know, in looking at what, you know, this circumstances has brought on, something I thought about is just the access to CPS, and maybe from a school or a district perspective, just reinforcing that expectation and the protocol for when to contact CPS and the expectations and obligations surrounding that. Also, just interdepartmental collaboration, just making sure that there are opportunities for the school counselor and the social worker, school psychologist, grade level, or departmental teams and administration to intersect in a digital space, to have conversations about what's going on with the kids. Who are we not reaching? What are concerns that you have? Also, messaging with parents and creating protocols and for interactions with parents. Something one of my students shared when we first began talking about this that I thought was brilliant was that, you know, the principal didn't just say, hey, call all the kids in your classroom. They gave the teachers sentence stems, how to start the conversation, how to, you know, inquire without being, you know, invasive, and, you know, had this whole session about, you know, here's what the goal of calling the parents are. This is a different kind of support. I thought that was nice. And also just indicators of explicit indicators of imminent and non-imminent dangers. You know, what are the look-fors that you need to pay attention to that raise concerns, and then what to do when you have those. Anything else from the panel to share, because we're right at the end of our time. I think we could just keep talking about this. I thank you so much for taking time out of your enormously busy schedules to engage in this conversation. I really appreciate it. I also like to thank the School of Education at UNC, at our the tech team who set this up, and the Dean's office who had this idea to kind of put us out there in this space. And to those of you who participated and raised questions and shared information and resources in the Zoom, thank you so much. I believe that it is everyone's responsibility to protect children. It's not just on the schools, it's not just on the parents. This is something where we're stronger when we do this work together. And you know, and every day, even on your worst day, you're still some kid's best hope. And that can't change because we have a virus. So thanks so much for joining us today. Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank
Chris, for
you.
moderating. It's good to see everybody.
Thank you for having
Take
us.
care,
Guys.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.